Okay. And is it just the money thing? Like, why would people not want to think of open source models when it comes to data sharing and information sharing?
Well, if you
Is it
look
just
at
a
all
profit
the
driven game?
yeah, but like it's kind of what it's kind of how do you create a business, and if you make something scarce that actually hasn't been scarce, you create what we call artificial scarcity, and by building walls around that data, you create economical value. So you kind of make something scarce, and like with the oil price, if you don't push enough oil out there, then oil prices go up. But you make it scarce by not producing as much oil as is needed. So if you kind of create these same kind of barriers, you are able to capitalize on the scarcity that is available. So that means that um, if you implement it in healthcare, you can create a lot of economical value in that sense by making something scarce that actually isn't scarce. And that's kind of the main principle that a lot of investors are aiming for by making something scarce and hoping to create huge profits out of that.
And when we talk about this data in healthcare, right, just to get a clear understanding of what you're saying, are we talking about the actual, for example, source code or design ideas and that sort of thing? Like, what are we actually talking about when we, especially for healthcare and medtech?
Well,
What are we trying to open source, for example?
Well, I would say, like in a simplistic way, it is
Yeah.
we want to open source the statistical relationships in huge data sets, because it's not about my individual data as a person that you want to open source, so my personal data becomes open to all others to see. That is not what we want to open source. The
Okay.
open sourcing is the creating huge cohorts of data that have really valuable statistical relationships that we then can also open source, which in healthcare you call biomarkers. So you kind of have in that data sets specific data points that can allow you to predict the onset of a disease, or is a biomarker to see that kind of therapy would fit to your profile. That's what we try to open source, like really the insights out of the data. But of course, to open source it, you need to open the data first and then open source
Yeah.
the insights that you get out of it. So we open source the data, but as well the extractions that you get out of the data.
Okay. And there has to be some sort of approval from the users, right? Because if we're collecting data from people, so how does that work in this whole landscape? um, you know is what if I don't want my data to be shared in open source? Do I have the choice to not give it away?
Well, yes, we have something what is called informed consent. So everybody needs to give their consent when data is being processed. Normally, if you give consent, you allow people to process that data for that specific reason that you gave consent. In healthcare, they say like, do you want to give your data for research, which is such a broad description.
Yeah.
Um, um,
Yeah.
what is research? But if that research leads to a drug that you can't afford yourself, why should you give your data and donate it in that sense? If then the extractions are being privatized and not available, so there is a huge gap in what is really consent and what is really informed consent. And informed consent has to do with the data literacy of the subject, the person that gives his consent. Does he really understand the concept of data? But it's also connected to how is the design of the consent form. And we all know when we download an app and we look at the terms and conditions
No one
of
reads
the app,
that.
no one reads that. And it's designed that way that you don't read it. Because if you would read it and if you would understand it, then the company would not have as much people accepting it. So it is kind of a gap in there. We need to fill that gap with and empower patients to get more insights in that what they really agree on. Because if you would do that on a paper-based level, a lot of people would understand it. Like if, for example, there was a time where messaging was not encrypted, and like WhatsApp wasn't encrypted at the beginning, and people were sending very intimate information through these channels, and then the companies were allowed to use that data and read that data. And it's like, okay, imagine now the same process on a paper-based level, and then somebody opening up your letters and reading that and selling that information for other users. Would you allow that? I said, no, I would never allow
Mhm.
this. But in the digital world, they would, because they have this really disconnection between what is the old world and what is that new digital world. There is not a lot of
And I think
educational awareness.
yeah, exactly. I was just going to say that because we're always quick to talk about digitizing the world and putting in place like all these really cool digital systems. But I think with that comes a huge burden of educating people on what is actually data and how is it actually moving from one place to another. I think there's really not a good understanding of that. And like you said, the whole encryption issue is a good example with WhatsApp and with any sort of communication platforms. How do we educate the world on understanding the value of data and the meaning of data? Is that part of what you're trying to do as well?